Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Professor David Tizzard, and welcome to Lecture 2, this course on world history. In our first lecture, we studied Chapter 1 of E.H Carr's book, What is History? Fantastic text, and I encourage you to read as much of it as you can. It's widely available in various places. Overall, looking at some of the responses and feedback from Lecture 1, I was pleased to see that the text challenged you and it made you reevaluate what your own interpretation and thoughts were about history. Not necessarily that you always had to accept what Carr was saying or agree with him, but instead that it made you step back and think about, well, actually, what is history? Do I agree with Carr's interpretation? Or do I take another view? That's the more important thing. It's not necessarily whether you agree or disagree with Carr, but it's whether you understand him and how that then affects your own interpretations of history. Today we'll do one more chapter, Chapter 3. It's very different from Chapter 1, and so hopefully it provides some more illumination into the subject of history. It's a bit more difficult, but we'll try to get through as much of it as we can. I don't think we'll cover all of it because then things get a bit too lengthy, and in the lectures I'm going to try to keep it to the things that I've highlighted. Before we start, I would like to bring you this quote. This quote is from Chapter 2. So this is E.H Carr in Chapter 2. It says this: "The historian, then, is an individual human being. Like other individuals, he is also a social phenomenon, both the product and the conscious or unconscious spokesman of the society to which he belongs. It is in this capacity that he approaches the facts of the historical past. We sometimes speak of the course of history as a moving procession. The metaphor is fair enough, providing it does not tempt the historian to think of himself as an eagle surveying the scene from a lonely crag, or as a VIP at the saluting base. Nothing of the kind. The historian is just another dim figure, trudging along in another part of the procession. And as the procession winds along, swerving now to the right and now to the left, and sometimes doubling back on itself, the relative positions of different parts of the procession are constantly changing, so that it may make perfectly good sense to say, for example, that we are nearer today to the Middle Ages than were our great-grandfathers a century ago, or that the age of Caesar is nearer to us than the age of Dante. New vistas, new angles of vision constantly appear as the procession, and the historian with it, moves along. The historian is part of history. The point in the procession at which he finds himself determines his angle of vision over the past." So whereas Chapter 2 builds on Chapter 1, which is why I skipped it, go and read it because it's a fantastic chapter. Where it builds on Chapter 1, this is a view of history in here from Carr that is really important to try to understand. Now, if you read this, it might not make perfect sense to you, so I'm just going to try to talk through a little bit of this and explain it. Now, first of all, let's take this idea that we can think of history as a moving procession. Okay, so we have this idea that history is something that moves along. However, Carr strongly speaks against the idea of the historian surveying the scene from above or beyond. That's not the historian's position. He's not a VIP, he's not an eagle, Setarom, looking down on things. Rather, the historian is just another dim figure as part of the procession. So that's the first thing. And what happens to the procession? This doubling back to the left and the right. And here's where the paradox that Carr brings in, or it doesn't seem logical, but that we are nearer to the Middle Ages than were our great-grandfathers a century ago. Now that doesn't seem to make sense. So let's just understand what Carr means by this. And we'll try to use this here before we're looking at the text. So what Carr is saying is that, okay, first of all, we have this idea of I'm going to draw a really bad train. My train looks like this. Let's put some wheels on it. Okay, and it can have some smoke. So this is history. Okay, history. It's the history train. The first thing, we have this idea that history is a procession, that it moves along. Okay, and Carr, okay, we can say that history moves along. So he's almost accepting that idea, but he's going to build on it. The first thing he says, though, is that the historian does not view history moving along from a vaulted position. The historian does not see this happening from up on a cliff. He doesn't have a bird's eye view, or she doesn't have this VIP perspective. So for Carr, this idea of history is wrong. So let's go to the first development that Carr brings in. He says that the historian is engaged in the procession. So if we continue with our train, this kind of train cart metaphor is something that you might see in Francis Fukuyama's End of History. It's how he closes out that book, actually, but he uses carts rather than trains. So if we have history going along, for Carr, the historian is inside history. Okay, so for Carr, the historian is not able to see this going along, but is caught up in history, is taken by the movement. So as history proceeds along the track, the historian naturally is going with it. The historian does not exist outside of time and space. Rather, the historian, as a human being, exists inside history. So, just like you and I, we exist inside a time. We don't see things from an external perspective. We are caught up in everything that's going around. So this is the first thing that Carr is doing here. But then he wants to say, so this view is discredited by Carr. He says that's not possible. Anyone that tries to do that, and whether the person is from 2020 and they're looking at, let's say, 1392, the start of the Joseon dynasty, but they're still in a moving position here. So this position is not static. It's always fluid. That's the first jump that Carr makes. Now, the second jump is the more interesting one, and perhaps one that wasn't really explained in chapter 1, which is why I want to bring it to your attention here. This track, this idea of history as a procession, as something that's moving. He explains it's possible for us to be closer to the Joseon dynasty than our grandfathers. Well, that doesn't make sense. So let's think of it like this. If we have the train was going along the track, and this would be, David, think of some things. This would be 1945. This would be 1948. This would be 1980. This would be 2020. We are naturally closer to 1980 and then 1948 and 1945. So there's a spatial distance between these two. And so somebody in 1948 would be closer to 1945 than to 2000. That seems to make logical sense. That's what we assume. Carr says that's not correct. That is not how Carr views history in this linear procession of 1, 2, 3, 4. How Carr explains history, and you might have to forgive my drawing sometimes, but Carr's procession of history proceeds like this, and we'll keep the train and we'll keep the historian in it, and it would go, let's say, something like this. I feel like a kid drawing a snake, but it should make sense soon. So the track of history. And even this is not perfect enough, I guess, because it should double back on itself. So if this is 1945, and this is, let's say this is 1980, and this is 2000, this is 2010, and this is 2020, and so on, you could imagine. And history is still proceeding, and the people are still inside history. But you will notice that in 1980, the people are quite far away from 1945, and yet the people in 2000, they're a closer proximity distance in this way than they are to 1980. So the events and the people and the ideas of 1945 might seem more similar to the people in 2000 than the events and the times and the people in 1980. So it's not about this linear progression of going in a straight line from A to B. It's something that curves back on itself, and whether you start depicting it like this or however you want to depict time. But Carr is making this point that when we're in 1980, 1945 is still close to us. And therefore, we don't have perhaps the best vantage at the time. When we get to 2000, there might be developments in technology, there might be political changes, there might be social changes, there might be the revelations of new documents unearthed, and therefore we can see 1945 better from 2000 than 1980. And when we analyze then this time, we find that it's doubly causal, because then 1945 affects the present, because our new understanding of history affects us in 2000, and we change history. So it goes two ways. It goes this way and this way. The past affects the present, and the present affects the past, because as our new understandings of history take place, we reinterpret our views and we change our textbooks in the present. And also when we change our textbooks in the present, we say, well, these guys weren't actually the good guys, they were the bad guys. We're not sure. Was Stalin, with the Soviet Union in World War II, were they the good guys or the bad guys? Well, they helped us kill Hitler, so they must be good guys, but then they're communists and it becomes very complicated. This is to say nothing about ideology, which one is correct. But you see that the past and the present always in affecting each other. Moreover, it doesn't go in a line such as this, 1, 2, 3, 4. But this line could go anywhere. And instead of going this way, this line could go back on itself and things like this. So this is a really important idea to understand from Carr, that first of all, you can't exist outside of time and space when you judge stuff. You're inside history. Now that probably makes sense to you. We got a bit of that in chapter 1, but I don't think we got this in chapter 1. This was one of the main developments of chapter 2, and it's only really covered in that paragraph that I showed you, so it's easy to miss. That's why I'm bringing it out to you. So I hope that you understand Carr's procession of history here, what he is talking about, that we're stuck inside history, and that at different points and at different times our view changes. So in 1980 our view might be this, and 2000 our view might be that. Doesn't make one better or worse, but it means that we see different things, and different things become important to us. And when we see different things in the past, therefore then they affect the present. You probably want to have a good idea of the understanding of linear and cyclical time. For most parts, the monotheisms, Judeo-Christian, if you have Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, believe in linear time, that the world starts at 0. We're currently in 2020 because, that's when Jesus was born, and we're going towards the end of days. There's a start and there's a finish, and that's sort of a social construction of time. Other parts in the East will have more cyclical time. So in Northeast Asian societies, you start with the rat, and then you go to the cow, and then you go to the monkey and the dragon and the tiger and the rooster and the snake. This is not the correct order, but then once you've done all the animals, you go back round again. It repeats. So there are different ideas of time, and Carr seems to adopt this more. It's not perfectly cyclical, but it snakes around and back on itself. So that's an idea that I wanted to present to you. It's taken from this paragraph in chapter 2, and I hope Carr's procession of history makes sense to you. I'm finding which buttons to read now. It's taken from, in case you're wondering, here, which is page 20 of this file. You can find it there. For now, let's have a look at this. Let's see how much of chapter 3 we can do. I don't think we'll do all of it, but let's see we get some good stuff from it. Carr begins. When I was very young, I was suitably impressed to learn that appearances notwithstanding, the whale is not a fish. Nowadays, these questions of classification move me less, and it does not worry me unduly when I'm assured that history is not a science. This terminological question is an eccentricity of the English language. In every other European language, the equivalent word to science includes history without hesitation. But in the English-speaking world, this question has a long past behind it, and the issues raised by it are a convenient introduction to the problems of method in history. Now, it is linguistic and taxonomical, so some students already in their work last time started looking at what is yoksa, how do these words come down, and what's their hanja based on these? Does it include science? Does it include the written records and the events gone by? So language and culture, the language and culture from which you are from, also affects how you perceive history, because language affects our brains. At the end of the 18th century, when science had contributed so triumphantly both to man's knowledge of the world and to man's knowledge of his own physical attributes, it began to be asked whether science could not also further man's knowledge of society. The conception of the social sciences, and of history among them, gradually developed throughout the 19th century, and the method by which science studied the world of nature was applied to the study of human affairs. In the first part of this period, the Newtonian tradition prevailed. Society, like the world of nature, was thought of as a mechanism. The title of a work by Herbert Spencer, Social Statistics, published in 1951, is still remembered. Bertrand Russell, reared in this tradition, later recalled the period when he hoped that in the time there would be a mathematics of human behaviour as precise as the mathematics of machines. Then Darwin made another scientific revolution, and social scientists, taking their cue from biology, began to think of society as an organism. But the real importance of the Darwinian Revolution was that Darwin, competing what Lyell had already begun in geology, brought history into science. Science was concerned no longer with something static and timeless, but a procession of change and development. Evolution in science confirmed and complemented progress in history. Nothing, however, occurred to alter the inductive view of historical method which I described in my first lecture. First collect your facts, then interpret them. It was assumed without question that this was also the method of science. This was the view which Berry evidently had in mind when, in the closing words of his inaugural lecture, January 1903, he described history as a science, no more and no less. The 50 years after Berry's inaugural lecture witnessed a strong reaction against this view of history. Collingwood, when he wrote in the 1930s, was particularly anxious to draw a sharp line between the world of nature, which was the object of scientific inquiry, and the world of history. And during this period, Berry's dictum was rarely quoted except in terms of derision. But what historians failed to notice at the time was that science itself had undergone a profound revolution, which makes it seem that Berry might have been more nearly right than we had supposed, though for the wrong reason. What Lyell did for geology and Darwin for biology has now been done for astronomy, which has become a science of how the universe came to be what it is. And modern physicists constantly tell us what they investigate are not facts, but events. The historian has some excuse for feeling himself more at home in the world of science today than he could have done 100 years ago. Let us look at the concept of laws. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, scientists assumed that laws of nature, Newton's laws of motion, the law of gravitation, Boyle's law, the law of evolution, and so on, had been discovered and definitely established, and that the business of the scientist was to discover and establish more such laws by process of induction from observed facts. The word law came down trailing clouds of glory from Galileo and Newton. Students of society, consciously or unconsciously desiring to assert the scientific status of their studies, adopted the same language and believed themselves to be following the same problem. The political economists seem to have been first held with Gresham's law and Adam Smith's law of the market. Burke appealed to the law of commerce, which are the laws of nature and consequently the laws of God. Malthus propounded a law of population, Lassalle an iron law of wages, and Marx in the preface to Capital claimed to have discovered the economic law of motion of modern society. Buckle, in the concluding words of his History of Civilization, expressed the conviction that the course of human affairs was permeated by one glorious principle of universal and undeviating regularity. Today, this terminology sounds as old-fashioned as it is presumptuous, but it sounds almost as old-fashioned to the physical scientist as it does to the social scientist. In the year before Berry delivered his inaugural lecture, the French mathematician Henri Poincaré published a small volume called La Science et l'Hypothèse, which started a revolution in scientific thinking. Poincaré's main thesis was that the general propositions enunciated by scientists, where they were not mere definitions or disguised conventions about the use of language, were hypotheses designed to crystallize and organize further thinking, and were subject to verification, modification, or refutation. All this has now become something of a commonplace. Newton's boast, hypotheses non fingo, rings hollow today, and those scientists and even social scientists still sometimes speak of laws, so to speak, for old time's sake. They no longer believe in their existence in the sense in which scientists of the 18th and 19th century usually believed in them. It is recognized that scientists make discoveries and acquire fresh knowledge, not by establishing precise and comprehensive laws, but by enunciating hypotheses, which open the way to fresh inquiry. A standard textbook on scientific method by two American philosophers describes the method of science as essentially circular. There's a lot in there, of course, but let's just break this down in what we're looking at, which is the difference between a hypothesis and a law. Now, we have this, the claim from Newton that he didn't look for hypotheses. We have it here, hypotheses non fingo, which essentially means I don't make hypotheses. It's not my thing. Because what people were doing in the sciences, they were making laws that were discovered. So the world is full of facts. And when you observe these facts, you observe what's going on. So this is 1, 2, and then 3, is that you describe them through a law. So people drop the apples and they say, wow, the apple always goes towards the ground. And I drop this here and this goes here. And I drop these two things and these two things happen. So these are facts that are happening and they're observed. And then you make a law that describes the pattern of the universe. And then this law has the idea that it's universal, that it's always applicable. And this was what a lot of science was doing. The law of evolution, the law of motion, the law of gravitation, all these laws which were meant to tell us what was happening. Now, what's a hypothesis? Hypothesis, the first thing, is you start with an assumption, or you start with a belief. So your hypothesis might be, the more a society does X, the more Y occurs. That's what I think. That's my hypothesis, but I need to now go and test it. And so you look at case studies and you work out whether it's true or not. So the really important thing between a hypothesis and a law, what's the difference? The difference, one of the biggest differences is, and I'm pausing to see if you answer, one of the biggest differences is the starting point. Here with a hypothesis, the starting point is a human assumption. It's a human thought. And this human assumption or human thought might be a desire, it might be an unconscious seeking of something. I'll come to that in a little bit, but the main point is, on the other hand, with laws, the facts are already there. It starts from the material world, and people just observe them passively and then describe what's going on. So when people promulgate or create laws, it starts from this world. It's observed and then it's described. When people have hypotheses, they come up with ideas. And from these ideas, then they look back in history to see if the history determines it, or they even do it in the present. But the difference is the starting point. So a hypothesis, the starting point is different from a law. And as society progresses, what Carr is observing is that the fascination between laws and hypotheses change. In the past, it was all about laws. Even Newton would say, no hypotheses for me, it's just strict facts, it's all about that. But as society changes, we realize now that, well, yeah, hypotheses are there. And it finishes with this: the method of science is essentially circular. This law is one way. The hypothesis is two-way. You have an idea, you check if it's right, and that tells you if it's right, so you check another thing, and you're essentially creating what is there by doing this as well. So I hope from this little section you might understand the difference between a hypothesis and a law, and how these have changed over time, and what that might say for the exploration of world history. We obtain evidence for principles by appealing to empirical material, to what is alleged to be fact, and we select, analyse and interpret empirical material on the basis of principles. The word reciprocal would perhaps be preferable to circular, for the result is not to return to the same place, but to move forward to fresh discoveries through this process of interaction between principles and facts, between theory and practice. This is really important in that circular thing. When I drew Carr's history, it was, it could be like this. It's not circular. Thinking requires acceptance of certain presuppositions based on observation, which makes scientific thinking possible but are subject to revision in the light of that thinking. These hypotheses may well be valid in some contexts or for some purposes, though they turn out to be invalid in others. The test in all cases is the empirical one, whether they are in fact effective in promoting fresh insights and adding to our knowledge. The methods of Rutherford were recently described by one of his most distinguished pupils and fellow workers. He had a driving urge to know how nuclear phenomena worked, in the sense in which one could speak of knowing what went on in the kitchen. I do not believe that he searched for an explanation in the classical manner of a theory, using certain basic laws. As long as he knew what was happening, he was content. This description equally fits the historian, who has abandoned the search for basic laws and is content to inquire how things work. The status of the hypotheses used by the historian in the process of his inquiry seems remarkably similar to that of the hypotheses used by the scientist. Take, for example, Max Weber's famous diagnosis of a relation between Protestantism and capitalism. Nobody today would call this a law, though it might have been held as such in an earlier period. It is a hypothesis, which, though modified to some extent in the course of the inquiries which it inspired, has, beyond doubt, enlarged our understanding of both these movements. Or take a statement like that of Marx: the hand mill gives us a society with a feudal lord. The steam mill gives a society with an industrial capitalist. This is not, in modern terminology, a law, though Marx would probably have claimed it as such, but a fruitful hypothesis pointing the way to further inquiry and fresh understanding. Such hypotheses are indispensable tools of thought. The well-known German economist of the early 1900s, Werner Sombart, confessed of a troubled feeling, which overtook those who had abandoned Marxism. When we lose the comfortable formulas that have hitherto been our guides amid the complexities of existence, we feel like drowning in the oceans of facts until we find a new foothold or learn to swim. We're getting into the idea that historian uses hypotheses rather than laws. Okay, so for history, we seem to be looking at hypotheses, not laws. You've got a couple here that he starts with. This should be Max. So Weber, the German sociologist, looked at the idea in terms of predestination, and Calvinism, and said that people with certain Protestant beliefs had the idea that the richer you were, the more that God had decided you were going to heaven. So heaven, your entrance into heaven was decided by how much money you had. So if you were rich in the world, that means God had already selected you to go to heaven. That doesn't have to be true or false. A lot of people might look at that and go, well, that's, a rather silly thing to believe. But people did believe it. It's not the point whether it's true or not. It's whether people believed it and how many people believed it and what effects it had. And what Weber said the effects of this were is that it made capitalism work. Capitalism itself, the idea of a free open market society rather than state central and top down, it wasn't capitalism that made it work, but it was this intangible belief inside people's minds. It was the thing that moved them that helped capitalism go along. Because they believed that they needed to be rich to demonstrate that they had been chosen by God, that made capitalism work, because money became a thing that they needed. And so this is not necessarily a law, but by Weber exploring the relationship between Protestantism and capitalism, we started understanding more about capitalism and Protestantism. So it's not about finding a law that lasts for all time, but it's about, well, Weber did that and explored it, and we know some more. So now we start exploring this some more, and our knowledge becomes built on these things. So that's the process, or the methodology that is being described here. The controversy about periodization in history falls into this category. The division of history into periods is not a fact, but 8 necessary hypotheses or tools of thought, valid insofar as it is illuminating and dependent for its validity on interpretation. Historians who differ on the question when the Middle Ages ended differ in their interpretation of certain events. The question is not a question of fact, but it is also not meaningless. The division of history into geographical sectors is equally not a fact, but a hypothesis. To speak of European history may be a valid and fruitful hypothesis in some contexts, misleading and mischievous in others. Most historians assume that Russia is part of Europe. Some passionately deny it. I must quote one general pronouncement on the methods of social science, since it comes from a great social scientist who was trained as a physical scientist. George Sorel, who practiced as an engineer before he began in his 40s to write about the problems of society, emphasized the need to isolate particular elements in a situation, even at the risk of oversimplifying. One should proceed by feeling one's way. One should try out probable and partial hypotheses, and be satisfied with provisional approximations, so as to always leave the door open to progressive correction. It's very different from the laws. Let's just take this idea. And this is why we might not finish the whole chapter, because we're always going to stop, but this, I believe, is important. The periodization of history falls into this category. What is he talking about here? The division of history into periods is not a fact, but a hypothesis. So, the Joseon dynasty. You all know the Joseon dynasty. Started in 1392. When did it end? So let me give you some ideas. 1392 until 1897. 1392 until 1905. 1392 until 1910. 1392 until 1945. Which is the correct date for the Joseon dynasty? Well, they're all kind of correct, aren't they? It depends. It depends what you're looking at, and it depends what you're looking for. So one of the weirdest answers, if you look at dynasties, dynasties are measured related to the kingdom, not the nation state. So while the nation state of Korea certainly was fallen between 1910 and 1945, there was still kings, and there was still a ruling family. They were acknowledged to a certain degree, and this even by the Japanese government, and this only changed with the start of the Republic in 1948 and Lee Seung-man. So you could look at it like that. You could look at when Korea became an empire. You could look when the Japanese colonization started, or you could look at the 1905 treaty. How you divide history is very, very difficult. And sometimes the dates of events will change. And if you look at various sources online for the Joseon dynasty, you'll find many different answers. I have put in surveys up online about which is the correct date of these, and they all receive answers. 10 people this one, 20 people this one, 50 people this one, but everyone has a different opinion. So it's not necessarily about a fact. It's about our interpretation and whether we're satisfied with provisional approximations and we leave the door open to progressive correction. It doesn't mean that any number is correct. Some of you are confused about, well, if it's not all facts and everything is open, like where are we? What's going on? And this is what he talked about drowning in the ocean of facts. This idea from Marx, or Werner, sorry. It doesn't mean any number is okay. That you couldn't really say the Joseon dynasty was 1392 until 2019. You'd have to have a very interesting argument to make that case. But there are different things that you can look at. So the division of history into dates. Some people like to put the First World War and the Second World War together, because it's a continuation or it's an extension of the same conflict. For the most part, the protagonists and the antagonists are the same. There was just a pause in between and then they started again. You might find that these absolutely concrete dates of World War I and World War II, maybe when we look back in 2105, in the future, the dates for these might have changed. The name of it might have even changed to some degree. It's very possible. So the division of history into periods is not a fact, but a necessary hypothesis or tool of thought. And why? Is it valid? Not everything is valid. It doesn't always count. It only counts as far as it is illuminating, far as is if it tells us something, gives us some information, and dependent for its validity on its interpretation. So that's an interesting idea there that you might want to consider, and hopefully that example shows you that history really can be open to interpretation. Go and ask people, when did the Joseon dynasty end? You'll get different answers, and I might have done this last time, but go and ask people, what is 15th of August? What year is it related to? And you'll get different answers. If your friends are progressive, they'll say 1948. If they're conservative, they might say 1948. 45, 48, sorry. Let's continue. Let's skip this paragraph because we need to skip some, and that's the same idea being repeated. Let's get to the next one. Analogies are, however, a notorious trap for the unwary, and I want to consider respectfully the arguments for believing that, great as are the differences between the mathematical, the natural sciences, or between different sciences within these categories, a fundamental distinction can be drawn between these sciences and history, and that this distinction makes it misleading to call history, and perhaps all the other so-called social sciences, by the name of science. These objections, some of them more convincing than others, are in brief. 1. That history deals exclusively with the unique, science with the general. That history teaches no lessons. 3. That history is unable to predict. 4. That history is necessarily subjective since man is observing himself. And 5. That history, unlike science, involves issues of religion and morality. I will try to examine each of these points in turn. This is what Carr is going to deal with in this chapter, these 5 points. History deals with the specific, science with the general. Let's see what we come with this. It is alleged that history deals with the unique and particular, and science with the general and universal. This view may be said to start with Aristotle, who declared that poetry was more philosophical and more serious than history, since poetry was concerned with general truth and history with particular. A host of later writers, down to Collingwood inclusive, made a similar distinction between science and history. This seems to rest on a misunderstanding. Hobbes' famous dictum still stands: nothing in the world is universal but names, for the things named are every one of them individual and singular. This is certainly true of the physical sciences. No two geological formations, no two animals of the same species, and no two atoms are identical. Similarly, no two historical events are identical. But insistence on the uniqueness of historical events has the same paralysing effect as the platitude taken over by Moore from Bishop Butler, and at one time especially beloved by linguistic philosophers. Everything is what it is and not another thing. And of course, you might find that quantum science and quantum mechanics sort of even starts putting this on its head. Things can be both wave and light form at the same time, and you don't know until you check them. Embarked on this course, you soon attain a sort of philosophical nirvana, in which nothing that matters can be said about anything. So this is the nihilism. This is where we got last time. Some of you are stuck on. The very use of language commits the historian, like the scientist, to generalization. The Peloponnesian War and the Second World War were very different, and both were unique. But the historian calls them both wars, and only the pedant will protest. When Gibbon wrote of both the establishment of Christianity by Constantine and the rise of Islam as revolutions, he was generalizing two unique events. Modern historians do the same when they write of the English, French, Russian, and Chinese revolutions. The historian is not really interested in the unique, but in what is general in the unique. In the 1930s, discussions by historians of the causes of the War of 1914 usually proceed on the assumption that it was due either to the mismanagement of diplomats working in secret and uncontrolled by public opinion, or to the unfortunate division of the world into territorial sovereign states. In the 1930s, discussions proceeded on the assumption that it was due to rivalries between imperialist powers, driven by the stresses of capitalism in decline to the partition the world between them. These discussions all involve generalization about the causes of war, or at any rate of war in 19th century conditions. The historian constantly uses generalization to test his evidence. If the evidence is not clear whether Richard murdered his princes in the Tower, the historian will ask himself, perhaps unconsciously rather than consciously, whether it was a habit of rulers of the period to liquidate potential rivals to their throne, and his judgment will, quite rightly, be influenced by this generalization. The reader, as well as the writer of history, is a chronic generalizer, applying the observation of the historian to other historical contexts with which he is familiar, or perhaps to his own time. When I read Carlyle's French Revolution, I find myself, again and again, generalizing his comments by applying them to my own special interest in the Russian Revolution. Take this on terror. Horrible in lands that had known equal justice, not so unnatural in lands that had never known it. Or more significantly this, it is unfortunate, though very natural, that the history of this period has so generally been written in hysterics. Exaggeration abounds, execration, wailing, and on the whole darkness. Or another, this time from Burckhardt, on the growth of the modern state in the 16th century. The more recently power has originated, the less it can remain stationary. First, because those who created it have become accustomed to rapid further movement, and because they are and will remain innovators per se. Secondly, because the forces aroused or subdued by them can be employed only through further acts of violence. It is nonsense to say that generalization is foreign to history. History thrives on generalizations. As Mr. Elton neatly puts it in a volume of the new Cambridge Modern History, what distinguishes the historian from the collector of historical facts is generalization. He might have added that the same thing distinguishes the natural scientist from the naturalist or collector of specimens. But do not suppose that generalization permits us to construct some vast scheme of history into which specific events must be fitted. And, since Marx is one of those who is often accused of constructing or believing in such a scheme, I will quote by way of summing up a passage from one of his letters, which puts the matter in its right perspective. Events strikingly similar, but occurring in a different historical milieu, lead to completely dissimilar results. By studying each of these evolutions separately and then comparing them, it is easy to find the key to the understanding of this phenomenon, but it is never possible to arrive at this understanding by using the passe-partout of some historical philosophical theory whose great virtue is to stand above history. History is concerned with the relation between the unique and the general. As a historian, you can no more separate them or give precedence to one over the other than you can separate fact and interpretation. We're looking here very quickly at the idea history. Is it specific or general? And now, the idea is that science deals with the general, it creates these laws. History deals with the specific, and you cannot apply what you learn from one situation A to situation B. What Carr is doing is saying, well, we have to consider this. The first one is linguistic. Linguistic, yeah, okay. Because the word war and the word revolution, and it's important in Korean as well, whether something is an uprising or something is a movement. We call lots of different wars. So the Peloponnesian War, with Sparta and Athens, and the Cold War were incredibly different. They used different technologies, they used different regimes, they were carried across different geographical and temporal states. One had nuclear weapons, the other had horses. But we call them both a war, so we generalize them. Why do we do this? Well, because linguistically, if we were to call every event a unique word, we would never be able to describe anything. We would get stuck in this way of unable to communicate, and then we would never learn anything because everything would be unique. So we do generalize in that we call things war and we call things revolution, even if the revolutions are completely different. Mao's revolution, the French revolution, the Russian revolution, they're all very, very different. And just going on to this idea of naming things, if you look at Gwangju, or if you look at 1987, if you want to look at Tiananmen Square, different events, are they uprisings? Are they movements? Are they revolutions? What you call them is very important, because then you put them beside other things. So there are lots of generalizations in history, Carr is pointing out, and it's linguistic. This is perhaps the place for a brief remark on the relations between history and sociology. Sociology at present faces two opposite dangers: the danger of becoming ultra-theoretical and the danger of becoming ultra-empirical. The first is the danger of losing itself in abstract and meaningless generalizations about society in general. Society with a big S is as misleading a fallacy as history with a big H. This danger is brought nearer by those who assign to sociology the exclusive task of generalizing from the unique events recorded by history. It has even been suggested that sociology is distinguished from history by having laws. The other danger is that, foreseen by Karl Mannheim, is almost a generation ago and very much present today, of a sociology split into a series of discrete technical problems of social readjustment. Sociology is concerned with historical societies, every one of which is unique and moulded by specific historical antecedents and conditions. But to attempt to avoid generalization interpretation by confining oneself to so-called technical problems of enumeration analysis is merely to become the unconscious apologist of a static society. Sociology, if it is to become a fruitful field of study, must, like history, concern itself with the relation between the unique and the general. But it must also become dynamic, a study not of society at rest, for no such society exists, but of social change and development. For the rest, I would only say that the more sociological history becomes, and the more historical sociology becomes, the better for both. Let the frontier between them be kept wide open for two-way traffic. You might notice that Carr's conclusions are often very similar, and that they're always trying to find the middle ground without being absolute either way. The question of generalization is closely connected with my second question, the lessons of history. The real point about generalization is that through it, we attempt to learn from history, to apply the lesson drawn from one set of events to another set of events. When we generalize, we are consciously or unconsciously trying to do this. Those who reject generalization and insist that history is concerned exclusively with the unique are, logically enough, those who deny that anything can be learned from history. But the assertion that men learn nothing from history is contradicted by a multitude of observable facts. No experience is more common. Let's just stop here when he goes into his own history. But let's break this down into what he's saying, because he said it already and we might have missed it. The general and the specific in terms of learning from history. What did he say? What's the point? If events are specific and they cannot be compared, so if the Second World War is a specific event and we shouldn't generalize it, we should only look at it as a Second World War, then we can never apply what we learn to other events. We might learn some things about that, but we can't draw lessons from it for the present or the future because it's specific and it doesn't have any implications elsewhere. If we see it in more general terms, we can say, well, this happened and similar things happened at another time, and they might happen in the future. So what we should be concerned about is these common elements. So whether you see events, or whether historians see events, whether sociologists, whether people want to try to understand how we look at things, Carr is saying that the logical conclusions of this relate to whether you can learn from history. If everything is specific, then we can't apply those rules elsewhere. And this is where, let's say, elements of ethnocentrism come in, or even Eurocentrism. You can get Asia-centrism, Africa-centrism, but the idea that you might look at the world through one lens, people often say this is incorrect, you can't do this, and they'll say it's ethnocentric because the history of Asia is different from the history of Europe. So you can't look at Korean or Chinese history by using the Treaty of Westphalia or by using the idea of the nation state, because they're Western concepts, and in Asia those concepts aren't really applicable. Now, there's a lot of validity in that, and a lot of sense might be made. But if you push that to the extreme, if you say that you can't compare events in Asia with events in Europe, then why would you ever study them? Because you wouldn't be able to learn anything from them in the present for your own society. You would learn about that specific event over there, but this is where he used the word static. It's static, it's still, and it's finished, and it's in the past, and there's nothing more that can be brought out from it. So this question of learning from history can occur across time, can occur across space, and it can also occur across cultures. So is history general or is history specific? Depending on the answer one takes from that and how you're allowed to look at events will determine how one answers this question, can you learn from history? That will be the logical conclusion. So you can't study specific events and then say, I'm learning from history. That would be, Carr would see that as a logical fallacy. If you want to learn from history, you have to see general history. There's lots of examples here of general history. Let's go to the third point because I think we've covered that enough. My third point is the role of prediction in history. No lessons, it is said, can be learned from history because history, unlike science, cannot predict the future. This question is involved in a tissue of misunderstandings. As we have seen, scientists are no longer so eager as they used to be to talk about the laws of nature. The so-called laws of sciences which affect our ordinary life are in fact statements of tendency, statements of what will happen other things being equal or in laboratory conditions. They do not claim to predict what will happen in concrete cases. The law of gravity does not prove that the particular apple will fall to the ground. Somebody might catch it in a basket. The law of optics that light travels in a straight line does not prove that a particular ray of light may not be refracted or scattered by some intervening object. But this does not mean that these laws are worthless or in principle, or not in principle, valid. Modern physical theories, we are told, deal only with the probabilities of events taking place. Today's science is more inclined to remember that induction can logically lead only to probabilities or to reasonable belief, and is more anxious to treat its pronouncements as general rules or guides, the validity of which can be tested only in specific action. Science de prévoyance, prévoyance d'action, as Comte puts it. The clue to the question of prediction in history lies in this distinction between the general and the specific, between the universal and the unique. The historian, as we have seen, is bound to generalize, and in doing so, he provides general guides for future action which, though not specific predictions, are both valid and useful. But he cannot predict specific events, because the specific is unique and because the element of accident enters into it. The distinction, which worries philosophers, is perfectly clear to the ordinary man. If 2 or 3 children in a school develop measles, you will conclude that the epidemic will spread, and this prediction, if you care to call it such, is based on a generalization from past experience and is a valid and useful guide to action. But you cannot make the specific prediction that Charles or Mary will catch measles. The historian proceeds in the same way. Just make sure you understand that, because that's just what he's going to repeat here. And you could do it with COVID-19 by saying that, and this would be a hypothesis, so hopefully you're slowly going to understand more about hypotheses and laws. If people gather in large numbers, the likelihood of people catching the disease increases. Now, that seems logical. We can't say for sure because we don't know if people might be old, if people are smoking, if they have health conditions, if it's in cultures where people shake hands when they greet, whether they kiss when they greet, whether you bow when you greet. But this is kind of like a hypothesis. And this is what generalizations help historians learn from the future. So we cannot say, you cannot get this idea of saying there will be. Because there was a French Revolution, a Russian Revolution, a Chinese Revolution, there will be a Egyptian Revolution. Because there was democracy in South Korea, there will be democracy in North Korea. These things don't quite work like that. We can learn, but not predict. So this idea of specific predictions with history doesn't work. We can't predict what will happen. And if people say, this is going to go there, this is going to go there, doesn't quite work like that. But it doesn't mean that history is useless. So again, you have these views of, can we predict the future from history? No. So that means we can't predict anything? No. It's a little bit more complex and sophisticated than that. Binary thinkings or opposites often find themselves pushing against each other. Carr's he's not finding the middle ground always because that's his ideology. It's not like the doctrine of the mean or something like that. What he's doing is he's looking at arguments in the field. So if you ever write a paper, sometimes you have to do a literature review. And when you do a literature review, you'll say, well, first these people said this, and then other people came along and said this, and they said this. You'll find debates in fields. So if you go into international relations, you look at debates between realism and liberalism. You look at the constructivist English school debates. There are arguments or debates that go on. The debate about anarchy, for example. And Carr is observing these debates, and he's finding that people take opposing views to each other. But the complexity and the sophistication he finds is that it's not about saying it's this one or this one. There's always something that people need to consider a little bit more. And the ideas in the middle aren't as pithy. They're not as easily understood. They're not as, if you say, for example, guns, germs, and steel, anyone can understand that. Middle school students can understand that. And that's what makes it so effective. That's what makes it so good, because it reduces things down just to 3 factors. And the world doesn't often work like that. Not to say that's not a good book by Jared Diamond, but the idea that, things are always here, it's a little bit strange. Let's move on. Let's go to the 4th point. My 4th point introduces a far more cognate argument for drawing a line of demarcation between the social sciences, including history and the physical sciences. This is the argument that in the social sciences, subject and object belong to the same category and interact reciprocally on each other. Human beings are not only the most complex and variable of natural entities, but they have to be studied by other human beings, not by independent observers of another species. Here a man is no longer content, as in the biological sciences, to study his own physical makeup and physical reactions. The sociologist, the economist, or the historian needs to penetrate into forms of human behavior in which the will is active, to ascertain why the human beings who are the object of this study willed to act as they did. This sets up a relation which is peculiar to history and the social sciences, between the observer and what is observed. The point of view of the historian enters irrevocably into every observation which he makes. History is shot through and through with relativity. In Karl Mannheim's words, even the categories in which experiences are subsumed, collected, and ordered vary according to the social position of the observer. But it is not merely true that the bias of the social scientist necessarily enters into all his observations. It is also true that the process of observation affects and modifies what is being observed, and this can happen in two opposite ways. The human beings whose behaviour is made the object of analysis and prediction may be warned in advance by the prediction of consequences unwelcome to them, and be induced by it to modify their action, so that the prediction, however correctly based on the analysis, proves self-frustrating. One reason why history rarely repeats itself among historically conscious people is that the dramatis personae are aware at the second performance of the denouement of the first, and their action is affected by that knowledge. The Bolsheviks knew that the French Revolution had ended in a Napoleon, and feared that their own revolution might end in the same way. They therefore mistrusted Trotsky, who among their leaders looked most like a Napoleon, and trusted Stalin, who looked least like a Napoleon. But this process may work in a converse direction. The economist who, by a scientific analysis of existing economic conditions, predicts an approaching boom or slump may, if his authority is great and his arguments cogent, contribute by the very fact of his prediction to the occurrence of the phenomenon predicted. The political scientist who, on the strength of historical observations, nourishes the conviction that despotism is short-lived may contribute to the downfall of the despot. Everyone is familiar with the behaviour of candidates at elections, who predict their own victory for the conscious purpose of rendering the fulfilment of the prediction more likely. And one suspects that economists, political scientists, and historians, when they venture on prediction, are sometimes inspired by the unconscious hope of hastening the realization of the prediction. All that one can perhaps safely say about these complex relations is that interaction between the observer and what is observed, between the social scientist and his data, between the historian and his facts, is continuous and continuously varies, and that this appears to be a distinctive feature of history and of the social sciences. Predictions, because they are made, can influence the results. We have here that humans in history, humans are both the subject and the object. They are that which is analysing and that which is being analysed. Now, in the sciences, if you're doing physics, you have the natural world, and you have humans. The subject and the object is different in the sciences. When we analyse geographical formations, when we analyse the clouds, when we look at trees, when we look at stone formations, and when we look at particles, atoms, molecules moving, we are not necessarily analysing ourselves, we're analysing something different, and so therefore we get a perspective which is removed. However, what Carr is pointing out here is that in history we become the kind of alpha and omega, we become the subject and the object at the same time, and we have to try to penetrate into forms of human behaviour in which the will is active to ascertain why people did as they did. Now, in any kind of psychology, whether you go from Freud to Jung or onwards, you'll find that we don't know why we do things. Even, for example, you might do things that you don't understand or you don't realize. You know you've got an assignment tomorrow, but you go out drinking tonight and you're like, oh, I knew it, I knew I had that, but I still did it. We do things that we don't want to do, and we do things we don't know why we do them. We're not in perfect control of ourselves. So if you take that inside out idea of Riley Anderson, of these emotions building up in us, you have happiness and anger and depression, and they're all fighting to control us, and they all have their own motivations. You see the same thing in Freud's idea with the ego, the superego, and the id. Carl Jung has the collective unconsciousness. That's how he changes it. Daniel Kahneman with his thinking fast and slow, Nietzsche with the Apollyon and Dionysian. So many thinkers divide us up, and we get this idea that we don't know what we're doing. There was a Wonder Woman film maybe a couple of years ago when they were making all the superhero films. There was a Wonder Woman film, and she was in the First World War, I believe, and the German soldier had been visited or had been possessed by rage. It was this emotion that had visited him. He didn't know what he was doing. He was acting in ways that he didn't know. So the point of this is, when we try to analyze people to work out why they did what they did, why did Hitler do this? Why did Stalin do this? Why did Kim Dae-jung? Why did Lee Sung-man? Oh, why did Mao? Why did they do these things? Well, they don't know sometimes. It's us, we can interpret and we can try to get into these things. But often the times, the people that were doing these things, they didn't know either. And that's the problem of having, it's the problem and it's also the beauty, we should say, but it's what differs history from the sciences, in that humans become the subject and the object. They become the thing studied and the thing studying. The other idea that he brings down with history is that we might create history or the future. What's the difference between history and the future? They're the same thing, aren't they? Through our predictions. I think you're going to do some amazing work this week. You might not have going to be doing some amazing work. Just send it in. That's totally fine. But me making that prediction might actually make it happen. So because there's been a lot of talk about this with Republican senators selling their stocks and making money off the COVID-19 situation and things like this, when powerful people, whether they're economists or social scientists, predict something's going to happen, when other people interpret that, then it might start making that thing happen. This is very different from sciences in the natural world. Unless you're a Jedi, Luke Skywalker, that's old Star Wars, but you know what I mean, and you think this rock is going to move, the rock is not going to move. Okay, the rock doesn't care about your thoughts. It's very different from if I say, I think you might do this. Then you're not sure whether you should do it or not. Because I've said it, now you're influenced by it. The natural world is not influenced by it. Ideas and words and predictions, and depending who they come from, can really affect the course of history in ways that sciences cannot. So can we predict what's going to happen? Well, we can use generalizations. I gave that COVID-19 and social distancing. So we can't predict specifics with history, but we can use generalizations and we can use hypotheses to talk about the future. It gets more complicated when you consider the subject and object, in that our predictions can actually make the future, and the future then becomes history because as time passes. So we can make history through our predictions. And if we didn't make those predictions, if we didn't have those ideas, if we didn't do those things, then those things never happened. Imagine you wanted to study the 1970s, 1980s Minjung movement, Undongwan movement in South Korea through the importance of pop songs. You say, well, I believe that they were driven by pop songs, and it was music that did it, and this song came out at this time and it reflected the people, and then another song came out Well, in the past, the people might not have acted upon that, but you build this hypothesis and you explain it, and then all of a sudden maybe that does become a fact in the past. The same thing applies in the future. Well, I think in the future, South Koreans are going to become more aware of X and start living according to Y. And I write that and I put it in the paper, and people, I don't have that much influence that people will act on what I write, but somebody writes that, puts that in the paper, and then people start acting like it. So it's what comes first, the cause or the effect, the chicken or the egg. It's a very difficult thing. Hope you understand that. Here you get this idea, I'll move on, this idea that because the Bolsheviks knew what was coming with Napoleon, they tried to get rid of Trotsky, but they got Stalin. So this is the Oedipus troubles, where you're worried that your son is going to kill the father and marry the mother, so you send him away, and then he grows up and becomes a soldier and comes back and kills the father and marries the mother. There's some things Hegel called the cunning of reason. Some things happen that you can't predict. Sometimes the opposite happens. So everything what I've said, you might make a prediction and it comes true. You might make a prediction and the opposite happens. Because that's what happens with humans. Let's have a look. Let's move this. Let's try to get down to the 5th point, I think. We should be coming up to that time. Here we go. Last but not least, I have to discuss the view that history, being intimately involved in questions of religion and morality, is thereby distinguished from science in general, and perhaps even from the other social sciences. Of the relation of history to religion, I shall say only that little is necessary to make my own position clear. To be a serious astronomer is compatible with belief in a God who created and ordered the universe, but it is not compatible with belief in a God who intervenes at will to change the course of a planet, to postpone an eclipse, or to alter the rules of the cosmic game. In the same way, it is sometimes suggested a serious historian may believe in a God who has ordered and given meaning to the course of history as a whole, though he cannot believe in the Old Testament kind of a God who intervenes to slaughter the Amalekites or cheats on the calendar by extending the hours of daylight for the benefit of Joshua's army. Nor can he invoke God as an explanation of particular historical events. Father Darcy, in a recent book, attempted to make this distinction. It would not do for a student to answer every question in history by saying that it was the finger of God. Not until we have gone as far as most in tidying up mundane events and the human drama are we permitted to bring in wider considerations. The awkwardness of this view is that it appears to treat religion like the joker in the pack of cards, to be reserved for really important tricks that cannot be taken in any other way. Karl Barth, the Lutheran theologian, did better when he pronounced the total separation between divine and secular history, handed over the latter to the secular arm. Professor Butterfield, if I understand him, means the same thing when he speaks of technical history. Technical history is the only kind of history you or I are ever likely to write, or he himself has ever written. But by use of this odd epithet, he reserves the right to believe in an esoteric or providential history with which the rest of us need not concern ourselves. Writers like Berdyaev, Nebhar, and Mauritian purport to maintain the autonomous status of history, but insist that the end or goal of history lies outside history. Personally, I find it hard to reconcile the integrity of history with belief in some super-historical force on which its meaning and significance depend, whether that force be the God of a chosen people, a Christian God, the hidden hand of the deist, or Hegel's world spirit. For the purpose of these lectures, I shall assume that the historian must solve his problems without recourse to any such deus ex machina, that history is a game played, so to speak, without a joker in a pack. We get this technical history. This is from Butterfield. And a providential history. And other writers as well. You have history and you have another history. So if I just take you back to the idea of the train track that we had going around, I just drew it quickly. there are some people that believe, and this is religion and history. There are some people who believe if this is history, this is normal history, but there's how would we picture this? There is another history. And maybe this history goes this way. One history is the history of man, and it goes backwards and forwards, but there's a broader, bigger history. So when I mentioned earlier about the Judeo-Christian tradition with linear history, there's a beginning when Jesus was born, and there's an end of days and revelation. And this historical track is set, and it's going. The human's historical track may go like this, but there are two kind of histories to some people if you have religion. And, they've described it with technical history and providential history, like the history that we study, and the history of God or the divine, or whatever name you would like to put on that. It doesn't even have to be religious, perhaps. It might be this kind of manifest destiny. Is the North Korean one might be like this, with the North Korean vision or the utopia of a socialist state with Kim Il-sung forever at the top and everyone will bow to them. Yeah, he's kind of like a god, but it's not in that traditional thing that we think of gods like this. So get the idea that some people have two tracks of history. They have human history, and then they have divine or religious history, which goes over the top, and the two don't necessarily have to go together, because the religious history is set and it knows where it's going, and the human history might change and go backwards and forwards while the real history is going along, or to the religious people, the real history, I mean to say. That's religion and history. Let's have a look at morality. The relation of history to morality is more complicated, and discussions of it in the past have suffered from several ambiguities. It is scarcely necessary today to argue that the historian is not required to pass moral judgments on the private life of the characters in his story. The standpoints of the historian and of the moralist are not identical. Henry VIII may have been a husband and a good king, but the historian is interested in him in the former capacity only in so far as it affected historical events. If his moral delinquencies had had a little apparent effect on public affairs, as those of Henry II, the historian would not need to bother about them. This goes for virtues as well as vices. Pasteur and Einstein were, one is told, men of exemplary, even saintly private lives. But suppose they had been unfaithful husbands, cruel fathers, and unscrupulous colleagues. Would their historical achievements have been any the less? And it is these which preoccupy the historian. Stalin is said to have behaved cruelly and callously to his second wife, but as a historian of Soviet affairs, I do not feel myself much concerned. This does not mean that private morality is not important, or that the history of morals is not a legitimate part of history. But the historian does not run aside to pronounce moral judgments on the private lives of individuals who appear in his pages. He has other things to do. This is, I hope you're getting this idea. The private morality of historic individuals. That's what he's talking about. So if people will say that Jefferson or Lincoln had slaves, then this provides ground, or this provides reason to discount what they did, or to cancel their work. This is part of, you see this a lot in the cancel culture these days, or no platforming, that someone's private morals should affect their public worth, especially in history. Now, Carr is saying that we shouldn't worry for historic figures. We need to worry about their role in history, not about their private moral lives. Let's see this argument unfold. I didn't mean to delete that, but I did. The more serious ambiguity arises over the question of moral judgments on public actions. Belief in the duty of the historian to pronounce moral judgments on his dramatis personae has a long pedigree, but it was never more powerful than in 19th century Britain, when it was reinforced both by the moralizing tendencies of the age and by the uninhibited cult of individualism. Rosebery remarked that what English people wanted to know about Napoleon was whether he was a good man. Acton, in his correspondence with Creighton, declared that the inflexibility of the moral code is the secret of the authority, the dignity, and the utility of history, and claimed to make history an arbitrary of controversy, a guide of the wanderer, the upholder of the moral standard which the powers of earth and of religion itself tend constantly to depress. A view based on Acton's almost mystical belief in the objectivity and supremacy of historical facts, which apparently requires and entitles the historian, in the name of history as a sort of superhistorical power, to pass moral judgments on individuals participating in historical events. This attitude still sometimes reappears in unexpected forms. Professor Toynbee described Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia in 1935 as a deliberate personal sin, and Sir Isaiah Berlin, in the essay already quoted, insists with great vehemence that it is the duty of the historian to judge Charlemagne or Napoleon or Genghis Khan or Hitler or Stalin for their massacres. This view has been sufficiently castigated by Professor Knowles, who in his inaugural lecture quoted Motley's denunciation of Philip II. If there are vices from which he was exempt, it is because it is not permitted by human nature to attain perfection even in evil. Fabulous. And Stubbs' description of King John, polluted with every crime that could disgrace a man, as instances of moral judgments on individuals which it is not within the competence of the historian to pronounce. The historian is not a judge, still less a hanging judge. But Croke also has a fine passage on this point, which I should like to quote. The accusation forgets the great difference that our tribunals, whether juridical or moral, are present-day tribunals designed for living, active and dangerous men, while those other men have already appeared before the tribunal of their day, and cannot be condemned or absolved twice. They cannot be held responsible before any tribunal whatsoever, just because they are men of the past who belong to the peace of the past, and as such can only be subjects of history, and can suffer no other judgment than that which penetrates and understands the spirit of their work. Those who, on the plea of narrating history, bustle about as judges, condemning here and giving absolution there, because that they think that this is the office's history, are generally recognised as devoid of historical sense. And if anyone cavils at the statement that it is not our business to pass moral judgment on Hitler or Stalin, or, if you like, on Senator McCarthy, this is because they were the contemporaries of many of us, because hundreds of thousands of those who suffered directly or indirectly from their actions are still alive, and because, precisely for these reasons, it is difficult for us to approach them as historians and to divest ourselves of other capacities which might justify us in passing judgment on their deeds. This is one of the embarrassments, I should say, the principal embarrassment of the contemporary historian. But what profit does anyone find today in denouncing the sins of Charlemagne or of Napoleon? The idea here, I'm sure you've got it, but for those who struggle, the historian's job is not to judge the moral behavior of past figures. There are reasons for and against. Some people have said that we should judge them, and their actions are sins, and what they've done are bad. And Croquet, you saw above, saying that we can't judge the past through the present, and people have to be judged in their time, not at other times. Carr brings, so that was Croquet's argument against it, supporting this. Another one here is, it is hard for us to divest ourselves of our other capacities. So when we judge historical characters, to be good or bad, to be righteous, we might be showing, or we might be demonstrating, our own interests. And this is a repeat of chapter 1 a little bit, that when you look at the past, it's telling you more about yourself and the present and how you feel about the problems in society, but also on the idea that you might be condemning certain people because they went against your present or current ideology, and you might be praising other people in the past because they support your present or current ideology. So when we're judging these people in the past, it's often not judging them from an absolute standard, but people do it because it gives them political gain in the present. So that's a point there that Carr is making. What about events? Let us therefore reject the notion of the historian as a hanging judge and turn to the more difficult but more profitable question of passing of moral judgments not on individuals but on events, institutions or policies of the past. These are the important judgments of the historian, and those who insist so fervently on the moral condemnation of the individual sometimes unconsciously provide an alibi for whole groups and societies. The French historian Lefebvre, seeking to exonerate the French Revolution from responsibility for the disasters and bloodshed of the Napoleonic Wars, attributed them to the dictatorship of a general whose temperament could not easily acquiesce in peace and moderation. Germans today welcome the denunciation of Hitler's individual wickedness as a satisfactory alternative to the moral judgment of the historian on the society which produced him. That's a very thought-provoking line. Go and think about this one, please. Russians, Englishmen and Americans readily join in personal attacks on Stalin, Neville Chamberlain or McCarthy as scapegoats for their collective misdeeds. Moreover, laudatory moral judgments on individuals can be just as misleading and mischievous as the moral denunciation of individuals. Recognition that some individual slave owners were high-minded was constantly used as an excuse for not condemning slavery as immoral. Weber refers to the masterless slavery in which capitalism enmeshes the worker or the debtor, and rightly argues that the historian should pass moral judgment on the institution, but not on the individuals who created it. The historian does not sit in judgment on an individual Oriental despot, but he is not required to remain indifferent and impartial between, say, Oriental despotism and the institutions of Periclean Athens. He will not pass judgment on the individual slave owner, but this does not prevent him from condemning a slave-owning society. Historical facts, as we saw, presuppose some measure of interpretation, and historical interpretations always involve moral judgments, or, if you prefer a more neutral-sounding term, value judgments. This is a very thought-provoking idea that Germans like to play up. This is Carr's idea. I should say it's not my idea, but you learn from this. Germans like to play up the evil of Hitler because then that removes responsibility from the society itself. So the more evil that Hitler is, or the more evil Hitler is portrayed, the more people talk about his bad morals, his immoral character, then that deflects some of the responsibility from the German people. And you could also see examples like that with Kim Il-sung or Park Chung-hee. I'm not saying they're similar to Hitler in that sense, but with any leader, you can see how that works. That's a very interesting point there. I'll be very curious to know what your thoughts on that are. Carr also mentions that we can criticize or pass judgments, value judgments or moral judgments on the institutions, but not the individuals. So we can condemn a society, but not the individual. We can say that slavery is bad, but not say that the slave owner is bad. We can say that that society is not good, but not the people in it. So there's a difference between society and the individual, according to Carr. We should think about finishing here because we're up to over an hour 30, and I want to make sure that you remain up and you don't sort of lose the place, and there's still quite a few to go. Excuse me while I talk to myself and scroll down. We start from, let me sum up. Let me sum up what I've tried to say about the claim of history to be included among the sciences. The word science already covers so many different branches of knowledge, employing so many different methods and techniques, that the onus seems to rest on those who seek to exclude history rather than on those who seek to include it. It is significant that the arguments for exclusion come not from scientists anxious to exclude historians from their select company, but from historians and philosophers anxious to vindicate the status of history as a branch of humane letters. The dispute reflects the prejudice of the old division between the humanities and science, in which the humanities were supposed to represent the broader culture of the ruling class, and science the skills of the technicians who served it. The words humanities and humane are themselves in this context a survival of this time-honoured prejudice, and the fact that this antithesis between science and history will not make sense in any language but English suggests the peculiarly insular character of the prejudice. My principal objection to the refusal to call history a science is that it justifies and perpetuates the rift between the so-called two cultures. The rift itself is a product of this ancient prejudice, based on a class structure of English society, which itself belongs to the past. And I am myself not convinced that the chasm which separates the historian from the geologist is any deeper or more unbridgeable than the chasm which separates the geologist from the physicist. But the way to mend the rift is not, in my view, to teach elementary science to historians or elementary history to scientists. This is a blind alley into which we have been led by muddled thinking. After all, scientists themselves do not behave in this way. I have never heard of engineers being advised to attend elementary classes in botany. One remedy I would suggest is to improve the standard of our history, to make it, if I may dare to say so, more scientific, to make our demands on those who pursue it more rigorous. History, as an academic discipline in this university, is sometimes thought of as a catch-all for those who find classics too difficult and science too serious. One impression which I hope to convey in these lectures is that history is a far more difficult subject than classics, and quite as serious as any science. But this remedy would imply a stronger faith among historians themselves in what they are doing. Sir Charles Snow, in a recent lecture on this theme, had a point when he contrasted the brash optimism of the scientist with the subdued voice and antisocial feeling of what he called the literary intellectual. Some historians, and more of those who write about history without being historians, belong to this category of literary intellectuals. They are so busy telling us that history is not a science and explaining what it cannot and should not be or do, that they have no time for its achievements and its potentialities. The other way to heal the rift is to promote a profounder understanding of the identity of aim between scientists and historians, and this is the main value of the new and growing interest in the history and philosophy of science. Scientists, social scientists, and historians are all engaged in different branches of the same study, the study of man and his environment, of the effects of man on his environment, and of his environment on man. The object of the study is the same: to increase man's understanding of and mastery over his environment. The presuppositions and the methods of the physicist, the geologist, the psychologist, and the historian differ widely in detail, nor do I wish to commit myself to the proposition that, in order to become more scientific, the historian must follow more closely the methods of physical science. But historian and physical scientist are united in the fundamental purpose of seeking to explain, and in the fundamental procedure of question and answer. The historian, like any other scientist, is an animal who incessantly asks the question, why? In my next lecture I shall examine the ways in which he puts the question, and which he attempts to answer it. That brings us to the end of today's lecture. I'll come here so that you realize it's ending and you can start paying attention. Ba-ding, there's a good bell. Unintentional. We've gone through a lot today. It's one of those things where if you read the text by yourself, you'll come up with some ideas. A lot will pass you by. I've tried to visually describe and explain to you some of the things that I see in Carr's text. Look at those things. See if you understand them. See if you can pick them apart. Don't just accept them. Go through the text. Go through the video lecture. Try to get some direct quotes. That's very, very important. I need to develop this study habit in you. You notice when we were reading Carr, there's lots of direct quotes. In that one, you might not have noticed because the way it's presented, but if you read Carr or in the first file, there's footnotes everywhere. I'm not saying you have to do this amazing thing, but to demonstrate to me that you read it, try to quote Carr or the video, and that makes me realize if you go off on your own train of thought and do all this, well, that's great, and I appreciate you doing that, and it's stimulating you, but I want to see if you're able to get something from the text, like a textual analysis or a video analysis, and say, this is what was said, here it is, and now I'm going to build around this. Don't just go, this is what was said, and then this, and this is what was said, that's this. Carr didn't do that. That's not how you write. You can write like that. There are no rules, but it's not very persuasive. So, what is history? Is history a science? How about morality? How about when we start judging these things? Can we judge people of the past? Now you might have a better idea. You won't have a complete idea, but when we start looking at historical events and when we start looking at the characters of history, you might now better understand what is the purpose of analyzing them and where does our moral responsibility lie, at least according to Carr. So I'll stop here. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to get in touch. Try to do the work as best you can. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Have a great day, and I will see you next time. Thank you very